like 3 books at a time. I don't know. I like to try to do that. But I believe that literacy is absolutely critical. I think that is important, and we are so blessed. And I'm sure you all know that because you are here. We are so blessed to have writers and books right here in our community. A hidden gem, but that's not too hidden because they have been doing everything they can to make sure that people know that they are here. And it's up to all of us to be ambassadors, to talk about the importance of the work that they do. And I will tell you that as a father of 2 boys, it is important. Now more than ever, I understand the importance of reading. And not only do we host author events and Writers and Books also brings literature to residents across the city and to places like here at the Strong Museum. And I love that Rochester Reads bridges the gap between readers and authors. I think it's important to put readers and authors together because, you know, I haven't authored a book yet, but I can tell you I got a lot of material in the last 10 months. It would be a bestseller, trust me. But because I think that it's important to put authors and readers together because you can gain so much information, so much knowledge, so much connectedness by having the readers and authors come together. And I also love that programs like this are committed to equity and inclusion. We cannot rise as a society if we don't spotlight authors of various backgrounds, races, and ethnicities. That is so very important. Gotta be able to do it. And when I walk into my office, I have like an outbox that you can inbox, outbox, and I walk back into the mayor's office and I see there's 2 books. This year's featured book, this hell of a book. I thought this is interesting. But that journey of a Black author who sets off across the country on a publicity tour promoting his best-selling novel. I'm sure many of us see ourselves in those books, and this is why, again, it's important to bring authors and readers together. And I'll just end with a quote. I was named after Malcolm X after he took his Hajj to Mecca, even though my father was a Baptist preacher. That's a whole nother story. But he said something very powerful. He said, books have the power to change us. In other words, Malcolm, in the words of Malcolm X, he said, people don't realize how a man's whole life can be changed by one book. And Lord knows we live at a time when people read more nonsense on the internet than they read books. And I think that our society would be much better if we read more books. So I agree wholeheartedly. That one book can change your life. And I'm sure this author's books the author you are hearing from today, hell of a book. I'm sure that this book will also change so many lives. So thank you so much for having me tonight. And it's great to see you all. And it is my honor. I'm sorry. It is my honor to introduce Cassandra. She has one of the best names ever, Cher, like the singer. Cassandra Cher. Give it up for Cassandra Cher.
Thank you so much, and also a way to make things less awkward for everybody. So well done. Good evening, everyone. It is both my honor and pleasure to be asked to introduce you all to today's author, Jason Mott. I'm sure you're all aware, Jason Mott is an exceptional novelist and poet. His 4th novel, which we're here to discuss, Hell of a Book, isn't just a book. It is an experience. The novel skillfully weaves together the stories of and experiences of 2 unique yet very similar characters. A child named Soot, named for his dark complexion, and an unnamed author who is promoting his book, also named Hell of a Book. Throughout this story, Mott first kindly asks us and then later demands that we look beyond the pages and question the costs that we pay as Americans to live in a society that, for better or worse, we have created. The novel asks its readers to wrestle with hard and frankly painful questions, such as, What does it mean to live in a society built on systems of profound inequality and oppression? What toll does racism take and systematic violence, not only on those who are actively being oppressed, but on all of us? His work forces us to think honestly about what it means to keep caring about one another and the horrors of the world. And more frighteningly, at what point do these horrors overwhelm us? And we are forced into this repetitive self-protective performance of false care. That false care that has us nodding and making all the right sympathetic noises while just refusing to truly see what's happening daily. The beauty of Mott's book is that the experience of reading it changes depending on who you are and when you're reading it. For example, as I read Sid's story, I found myself deeply troubled by this young Black boy's desire to protect himself by becoming invisible. His certainty that being unseen by the world is the only way to be safe from the world. Yet I know that I'm disturbed, not just because this perspective is disturbing, and it is upsetting, it is disturbing, but also because I know that when I was Sid's age, I believed the exact same thing. And now that I'm closer to the author's age, I know how much of a lie it is. It's hard remembering that, but also essential. As a result, I think that we will have many conversations today that are very essential. But remembering that doing so isn't a chore. It is painful, but it's a necessary pain. It is a connection of a profound kind. After all, to paraphrase Hell of a Book, the work we do today is a kind of love story, one that Jason Mott has come here to share with us. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Jason Mott.
Ooh, thank you. Make me feel like the Rolling Stones. So thank you all for having me. Thanks for bringing me to Rochester. I've been having a terrific 3 days since I've been here. Everyone has been exceedingly nice and friendly, and you cannot ask for more. So I want to definitely take time to thank all of you before I get started tonight. Again, it's been a really terrific. And just as a note, if you see me looking down at my phone, it's not because you're not important. I want to text people. It's because I have a timer that lets me know to not talk for 8 hours. I try to be really adamant about timing myself. So the way that I hope to do this is I'll talk for about roughly 20 to 30 minutes and then do the question and answer part. Like, I love engaging in the conversation, and oftentimes my best answers and my most meaningful thoughts come out of the Q&A more so than they do out of me just talking at you. I do want to talk a little bit different tonight. So if you've been to my 3 previous shows, this show will be a little bit different than the others. There's one couple, are they here tonight? The DeMarcos? Like, there's one couple who has been to like 3 of these things. I'm glad they took tonight off, good, because I felt like they were just gluttons for punishment. It's like, why do you keep coming to see me? You heard these songs before. So I want to kind of treat tonight a little bit differently and start from a different place and maybe lead to a different end. So obviously we're here to talk about Hell of a Book. And for those of you who have not read it, because I never want to assume people have read it, Hell of a Book is the story of an author on book tour. And as he's traveling around the country on this very rabid, kind of nonsensical book tour where he's drinking and womanizing and doing all the things you imagine authors do on book tour. As he's traveling around, he sees this young boy who's about 10 years old with very dark skin. And he calls him simply the Kid. And as he progresses from city to city, this same kid keeps showing up all across the country in these different locations. And he engages in this very kind of metaphysical conversation with the kid as he's moving around. And during this time, both he and the kid begin hearing about these shootings that have happened somewhere. But the author is hesitant to ever like give them any time. He just kind of ignores and keeps moving along. So that is the main narrative. Now there's also a secondary narrative of a young boy from southeastern North Carolina named Soot. Soot is about 10 years old, has very, very dark skin, is bullied a lot on the bus, And Soot's narrative, without giving too much away, it has a much more direct interaction with policing and police violence. I'll just say it that way. And eventually, as the story progresses, these two narratives begin to merge and blend and hopefully create a discussion about America, about racism, about our history and our possible future, and just the weight that exists when you live as a minority in America. Very heavy, serious stuff, but also blended with comedy. So that is what the book is about. Now, I've told people, because people have asked a lot, people always ask, well, how much of you is in the book? And I tell people it's about 60 to 70% my actual real life and 30% fiction for plausible deniability. I want to make sure that I can just say no to anything I want to say no to, and no one can prove otherwise. That's how you do good things. And so with all of that in mind, like I give you all that background, partly because I want to tell you my life story tonight. I want to tell you how I got to where I am. And this is not the story that others may have heard so far. This story actually begins, because will lead into a larger discussion. One of my earliest memories of my mother, and kind of just as part of my earliest memories of myself, part of my earliest memories of life, I was around 5 or 6. And for those of you who may have met me already, like I've got a tattoo here that looks like 4-H, but it is not a 4-H tattoo. I don't know who is getting 4-H tattoos in the world or why you would get them, but I do not have a 4-H tattoo. I have a gear shifter. I'm a car guy, so I've got a gear shifter tattoo here. And people always ask, is it a 4-H tattoo? No. Who is getting 4-H tattoos? Like who is repping 4-H that hard? That, like, I'm gonna get it tattooed on my chest. Like I don't, but it's another discussion. So one of my earliest memories of my mother that ties into cars, when I was a boy, and I was born in 1978. So when I was about 5 or 6 years old, so early 80s, my favorite, absolute favorite show was the Dukes of Hazzard. Yeah, lots of yes, nods, heck yeah. I was the biggest Dukes of Hazzard fan on the planet. Every week when that episode was on, just a good old boy, like I knew the whole song, like that was in my heart. I love Dukes of Hazzard. Bo and Luke and Daisy and Sheriff Buford and all that kind of stuff going on, it was just my jam. Because you know, here is a kid who loves cars, and here's this beautiful orange, bright orange Dodge Charger running from cops and jumping across bridges and doing all kind of cool car stuff. Now, for those of you who do not know what the Dukes of Hazzard is, lucky that you're young, so congratulations. But if you don't know, Dukes of Hazzard drove this very beautiful 68, I think, Charger, bright orange, Confederate flag orange, you might say. And across the roof of the Charger that the Duke boys rode was a large Confederate flag. Now, me, being the young 5-year-old myself that I was, I had no clue what the hell a Confederate flag was. I just knew that the Duke boys had a cool car. And I really loved watching that. And I begged my mom, because, you know, back in that time period, the coolest thing you could do if you loved something was you bought the bed sheets. Yeah, that was high class, like devotion to the thing you loved. You bought the bed sheets. So I begged my mom for months, like, Mom, I want some Dukes of Hazzard bed sheets. And my dad was like, hell no. And he never told me why. He just had a stern hell no to every time I asked. My mother was much more forgiving. So eventually, as you can imagine, I come home one day and here's some beautiful, crisp, new Dukes of Hazzard bed sheets on my bed. And it's Bo and Luke and Daisy and the General Lee, which is the name of the Dodge Charger, and also the name of General Lee. And there they all are. And literally for years, I slept swaddled, this young Black boy, swaddled in the General Lee and Bo and Duke and all the rest of it. This beautiful Confederate flag draped across my body every night. And I think about that memory so often in my life, because years later, not long before my mother's very sudden passing, actually, like years later, I was around 19, maybe 20. I remember somehow I was talking to my mother and the topic of those bed sheets came up. And I don't remember how it came up. We just started talking about those old Dukes of Hazzard bed sheets. And I still hadn't connected, because again, for me, it's just part of my memory in childhood. I hadn't connected things. But my mom told me, she said, you would not believe the experience of buying those bed sheets. And I was, it was being 19, like, first I was like, huh? And then it like slowly, my synapses started firing. It's like, oh. And she said, yeah, she's like, I walked into Roses. Roses was a thing back then. I walked into Roses and I go to the aisle and I pick them up and I bring them to the front and I put them on the counter. And this older white lady checks me out. And she said, my mom said there was about 30 seconds of just her and I looking at each other. And she would glance at the bed sheets and glance back at me and glance back at the bed sheets and glance back at me as if, do you know what you're buying right now? And my mother, she bought them. She bought them because her son loved the TV show. He did not know about the Confederate flag. He did not know who General Lee was. He knew nothing about anything. All he knew was that his favorite show involved Bo and Luke and Daisy and about a fast car that jumped across bridges. And she wanted me to have that for as long as she could. So she never told me anything about the General Lee, the symbolism of the flag, none of that. She let me sleep in those bed sheets for years. And to this day, if I could thank her for anything, it would be for that. Not because I'm just that devoted to the show, but because she let me hold on to my innocence just a little bit longer. We all encounter that moment when your innocence cannot last anymore. Sometimes we take it into our 30s and 40s, ignoring life. But for me, I got to be about 8 or 9, and I got to have that innocence for just a little bit longer. My mother did a lot of that. So that's the first part of my narrative here. Another narrative, kind of part of the narrative here that leads to me being here today, involves books. Can you imagine? The author wants to talk about books. So one of my earliest memories of reading, I was a really big reader. And I live in a very small town. I live in this town called Bolton, North Carolina. If you do not know of it, you're totally okay. Your life is fine. You're missing nothing. It's a town of about 700 people, southeast of North Carolina. I live literally on a dirt road. I've lived there my entire life. I'm one of those people. And one of my earliest memories, like I was a big reader at an early age. I just loved books. And there was a library one town over called Rigglewood. Town was called Rigglewood. The library there was, to me, one of the best libraries on the planet. It still is, in my opinion. And it's because their children's section is literally a rail car, a full-size, fully functioning rail car. I don't know how they got it there, but it has like a small section of railroad tracks behind the building and a literal huge rail car sitting there that the rest of the library is attached to. Yeah, so you can imagine being a kid, loving cars and loving trains as kids do. And when you went to the library, that was their entire children's section. So here it was, when you go to the library, you would get to go and just sit inside of a rail car and it would be surrounded by books that were just for you. It was only the kids section. And so what my mother would do is, again, we lived in pretty rural North Carolina. So if you wanted to go to the doctor, if you had to go shopping, you had to drive into Wilmington, which is like a 40-minute drive. So in the summertime, my mom had a doctor's appointment or just was going to be a long day. She would pack my sister and I up in the car. She would drive us past the library and basically kick us out. She's like, here, go stay in the library. And we would spend the entire day in the library. And being small town, the librarians know who you are. They know you're coming. They talk to your mom ahead of time. And my librarian, when my sister and I got there, she would have a stack of books on the desk waiting for us because she knew we were coming. And she knew the books that we liked to read. And so she would just have them picked out and sitting there waiting for us. So we would just walk in and grab our stack of books and go sit in the rail car and read books. That was how we spent a lot of our summers growing up. And again, that is another beautiful memory of my mother and a memory of reading and how I kind of found literature at that young age. So then you progress to about when I was about 14 years old. At age 14, I was, again, avid reader. I love reading mythology. I love folklore. Like the Eddas and sagas of like the Northlands, like Northern Europe, are like my favorite. I love Beowulf. Anyone here knows the epic of Beowulf? It's all about a dude with a sword killing monsters. And you can't beat that, quite frankly. Especially for someone like me. Like I was the kid who was quiet and being bullied every day of his life. Like I was the weird kid who read comic books before they were cool. And you know, I sat there and I read Beowulf on the bus in the morning at 7 a.m. Here I am sitting there reading this, you know, Northern European literature and loving it. So I was bullied a lot. And the reason I love Beowulf is because, again, he was a monster he was a hero who was so strong and powerful that he could not be bullied. And for someone who lived in that, that was your dream, to not be bullied. So when I was 14, I was in a ninth grade or so, and I was in a writing class, English class, and we had to read a section from a novel called Grendel. And yeah, some people are nodding, they already know it. For those who don't know, Grendel, the novel, is the retelling of the epic of Beowulf from the monster's point of view. So you get to find out that the person that you thought of as the hero and the monster and this shining beacon of like goodness and moralism and all that good stuff was just as flawed and perhaps even the villain of that particular story. It kind of told this narrative that there was a whole other perspective to the world that you rarely got to see. And when you actually focus on that perspective, it made you look at the established ideas of society and culture in a very different way. It was a very powerful moment for me. I still vividly remember getting to the end of the book and reading it and closing it. And I felt like I was vibrating. It's a hard to describe feeling, but it was amazing. And I told myself, I want to make other people feel this way one day. That's what I want to do. I want to make someone finish a book and close it and just sit there and shake for a moment. I want to do that to someone. I think I want to be a writer. So that was my thought. Now, the reality is, again, coming from a town of 700 people in Southeast North Carolina, saying you want to be a writer is not an option. That's like saying you want to live on the moon for the rest of your life. In my town, when you hit 18, you had I'll say three options. Your first option was you joined the military. That was what most people did. Just went into the military, you went off and fought, or you did whatever. Your second options were you could go work at the local sawmill. My father worked for 27 years. Or you can go work at the local DuPont chemical plant. My uncle worked for 32 years. Like those were your options in my town. The third option was simply you ran away and never came back. That was the option most people my age chose. They left town and just disappeared. And you can notice in those three, becoming a writer is not any of those options. Writers do not grow up on dirt roads. Writers live in New York and LA and all these kinds of cool places where cool things happen. So I never believed in being a writer. I started writing stories and my mother was there supporting me and saying, this is cool, you should keep doing more of this. And I didn't believe her, of course. Because your mom always is nice to you. She tells you all the nice things. So then when I was in my early 20s, about 21 years old, 22, I think it was, my mother passed very suddenly. Had a stroke one day when I was away and came back and, a few weeks later, she was gone. And it hit me very hard, as the death of a parent does. Because up until that point, I'd never lost anyone who was close to me. And suddenly she was gone. And I had been working at this place in Leland, which is right beside Wilmington, actually, making rubber gaskets, which is great work, as you can imagine. You literally stood in front of a big metal oven 8 hours a night. And the oven would open and this billowing rubber smoke would come out. You would suck it into your lungs. You would reach into this 400-degree oven, pull out rubber tubing and peel it off and just cut it and put it in a case and send it off. And you would do that every 96 seconds. That door opened and you reached into the oven and pulled it off. And that was your job. And I did that for 3 years. You're just sucking in smoke. You would blow your nose and it would come out black. That was the job. But for me, that was what people did in that area. That was my future, and I was fine with it. And then one day my mother was gone, and I could not get her back. You don't think about that until it happens. And when she passed, I had this really powerful moment where I realized I don't want to suck in smoke for the rest of my life. I want to be a writer. I told myself that when I was 14. I told my mom that for the last few years. She told me I could do it, and I always put it off. I had kind of screwed up in high school because I didn't care about it, didn't know what I was doing. So after my mother passed, within 6 months, I had quit my job and enrolled in community college, the goal of becoming a writer. And this is where the handoff of patting parents on the back shifts from my mother to my father. Because my father, at this point, he was retired, had some heart issues. So he and I were living together. I was helping him with his health issues and he was kind of helping me financially. It worked out really well. But I told him, I said, I want to quit my job. And he said, why? Because, if he comes from that generation where if you're not digging ditches and cutting pucklewood all day, you're not really working. He said, why do you want to quit? I said, I think I want to be a writer. And he knew about this. He knew that I was writing short stories. He knew it was important to me. And he stepped back and he thought for a while and he said, do you think you can do it? I said, I have no idea. But I really want to try it. I said, it's something I love, and I think I want to give it 100% and give it a shot. But I'm gonna have to quit my job and be broke for a long time Are you okay with that? And he was. He said, you know what? We'll figure something out. We'll make it work. So I started going to school to become a writer. And we're going to fast forward through a lot of stuff at this point. I got an associate's degree first from community college, transferred to a four-year university. I got a bachelor's in fiction. So I was just hardcore writing every day, writing short stories, getting a couple published. I was on my way to becoming a writer. My father was there rooting and cheering the entire time. Then I left there. I went to graduate school. I was enrolled in graduate school. I was doing well. Got about a year into my first year of graduate school, and my father was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Very sudden. We had a year together before he passed. He never got to see me graduate from the creative writing program, but he did get to see me publish my first book of poetry, which was great. He carried it with him. He put it in his truck and carried it with him everywhere that he went. Like he went to church with it, like flashing like the Bible. Like, look what my boy did. Everyone told me like, your dad, show me your book. I know, he's showing everyone. He was the proud father for that year before he passed. He was so proud of that. And it was also very weird because the book is called, We Call This Thing Between Us Love. It is all about sex and dating and mishaps. And to have your father going to church, opening up and saying, read my son's poem about masturbation. It's beautiful, isn't it? If that's not parental love, I don't know what is. So my father passed away. I finished graduate school and I went to work at Verizon Wireless, which is a terrible, horrible job. I did that for 4 years, perpetually writing, perpetually sending out novels, getting them rejected one after the other. Then luckily I found an agent. My agent and I sold my first novel, which became The Returns. And suddenly I went from answering phones and hoping to be a writer to really and truly being an official writer. I was full-time author, traveling for book tour, doing all of that cool, awesome stuff. And my family was there to support me. My sisters were there. I have 2 sisters and a bunch of nieces and nephews, and they were all big fans. And this really cool phenomenon happens where I'm usually not one to believe in like cosmic lineups and the universe balancing. I think the universe is a cruel, terrible place most times, and we just have to find our way through it. But sometimes I question that because after my father passed, I suddenly was an orphan in strange ways, like literally and figuratively. I had no parents to celebrate all this wonderful stuff with. But when I was in college, I met this group of friends, and they were white. I have some of my best friends are white, as I say. And their parents, this very lovely couple who were about the same age as my parents, they basically adopted me, whether I wanted to or not. They came to all of my events. I went to the house for Thanksgiving. They became my new parents. They really filled in that gap that my parents had left as best they could, without even knowing they were doing it. They didn't know my entire backstory. They just knew that they loved me and they wanted me to be part of their family. And I still to this day communicate with them and send them books and go hang out. It's just wonderful. But suddenly here I was, best-selling author, and I'm traveling for book tour, and it becomes wacky, and I want to write about it. Like I said, I'm kind of fast-forwarding through some details here for a reason. So I wrote my first novel, and did well, and that was great. Or second novel did well, did great. Third novel did well, whatever. But throughout that entire process, I was often asked, why aren't you writing about race? You're a Black author, that's what you do. It's kind of your job to write about race. And it wasn't, and people, when I say that, people imagine white readers and white editors and white people telling me you should write about race. And it was not only them. There were plenty of Black people who read my work and they would say, why aren't you writing about race? My first novel, the main characters are white. They're an older white couple. I just discussed with you all, an older white couple that I love very much. That is the reason my first novel has this older white couple as the main characters, because I wanted to pay homage to this lovely family that had adopted me. But no one saw it that way. They just said, you're not writing about race. You should be writing about race. And my stance on it, though I never really discussed it with many people at the time, my stance on it was simply, I don't want to. I grew up watching reruns of Rod Serling and The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits and Star Trek. Those were the things that captured my imagination. So I wanted to write books and stories that had that same kind of imagination. And while yes, Star Trek and Twilight Zone, they do touch on social topics, but they are not shows that you think of as being social activism kind of shows. They're just stories that people watch. And I wanted to write stories that people read. More than that, weirdly enough, I never felt qualified to write about race. I felt that there were plenty of other people who were doing it better. Toni Morrison was out there kicking ass everywhere that she went. Maya Angelou was out there redefining poetry just all day, every day. And then you're shifting into Ta-Nehisi Coates, the rising of Ta-Nehisi Coates as like the leader of this discussion on all these topics. So my philosophy was like, they're doing it, like they got it handled. I'm gonna go write these weird stories and just not worry about all of that. They got it handled. The thought was, someone else will fix it. That is a thought I think we often all have about a lot of issues. And as it kept going, and like I said, I often talk about the Freddie Gray incident as being one of the inciting incidences behind my desire to write Hell of a Book. Freddie Gray was arrested, thrown in the back of a police van, bounced around very harshly by police without the ability to kind of defend himself, and he died. And Baltimore rioted for days, weeks actually. And I talked with a friend about that for a few weeks, and we started thinking about our lives as Black men and the impact that all these things had on us. And it was during that time that I remembered an incident from my own childhood that somehow I had honestly forgotten. When I tell you what the incident was, you're going to be like, how the hell could you forget that? And I think it comes down to the reality of our ability to compartmentalize. When I was 10 years old, and I talked earlier about the characters in my novel, the 10-year-old boy that the author meets, and the 10-year-old boy in Southeast North Carolina named Suds. When I was 10 years old, in my very small town of only 700 people, our mayor, who was Black, was coming home one night, and he was stopped by a police officer in his front yard. And he gets out, and I'll just say a scuffle ensued. There's a lot of just differing opinions of what happened that night. And the reason there are differing opinions is because not only was the police officer there, but our mayor's wife and daughter were there on the front steps watching the entire incident. So a scuffle ensued. And at the end of that scuffle, our mayor was shot and killed in front of his wife and daughter. For weeks, not weeks, I'll say about a week and a half after, it was small national news. Anyone remember the show Inside Edition back in the day? It was kind of like Dateline back for early people. We were on Inside Edition. Our small town was on there. Jesse Jackson came down and like marched. There was an actual march. I marched with Jesse Jackson at 10 years old. I barely knew who he was. I just knew he was really important. I marched with him. And as my friend and I were discussing Freddie Gray, I think it was 2015 that the Freddie Gray incident happened, 2016 or so, I realized I had forgotten that entire incident. I had just put it out of my head and just moved forward with life. As I was talking to my friend about it, I was like, how the hell did I ever forget that? How did I forget marching 15 miles as a 10-year-old over the death of my mayor? I have no idea how I'd forgotten that, but I had. Suddenly I remembered it. So during all of that time, that's when I started to realize that I was more than qualified to write about race, not because I had lived through that particular incident, but because I had lived in America. I think regardless of whatever color or creed you are, if you live in America, whether you want to admit it or not, you have encountered some form of racism. You have sat on some side of that fence, whether it is your active refusal to see it, which I think is very active. You have to actively work to not see certain things in America, or whether it is you are on the other side, the receiving end of so many of those issues. And so that is when I argue that I really got the courage to write Hell of a Book, because yes, Maya Angelou was still doing, I think she hadn't passed yet. Toni Morrison hadn't passed yet. She was still the goddess, the queen of writing. Ta-Nehisi Coates was doing it. Oprah Winfrey, everyone was doing it. But you know what? Nobody was doing it like the weird kid who grew up reading Beowulf and comic books. There was no one doing it that way. I looked around the literary landscape, which I knew fairly well because I had a master's in poetry and a bachelor's in fiction. And I realized that Black writers don't get to be absurdists. They don't get to be humorous and funny in their writing. They have to be stern and serious as they talk about writing. And I remember feeling that if there's anything that I can do, I want to make a space for the next generation of writers to say that If there's any of them who want to be the weird kid and tell weird stories, and they also happen to be a minority, they can point to the book that Jason Mott wrote and say, hey, look, you know what? Somebody's already done it. Some other weird kid before me already had this discussion, and he did it in a weird way, and it worked. So I can be the weird kid as a weird adult and tell these stories. So that is a lot of what led to the writing of Hello Book. And I tell you all of that because, again, all those stories tie together. The Dukes of Hazzard beginning, the shooting of the mayor, the death of my mother and father, the friends that I met, the white parents, that kind of white couple that kind of adopted me. All of those stories qualify me. And I argue that all of you here have stories that would probably qualify you to write about these topics as well. Don't make the mistake that I made. And what do I mean by that? The mistake that I made, like I told you guys earlier, I kept waiting for someone else to do it. I kept waiting for someone else to say it the way that I thought it needed to be said. I kept waiting for someone else. I think the perpetual hope is, you see this fire burning over here. And you know, you're like, well, someone's gonna fix it. Like, there's no way you're just gonna let it burn. So I'm okay. I don't have to worry about it. I got 18 other fires going. That one fire, someone else will fix it. Someone will write the book. Someone will do the march. Someone will give the speech. Someone will do something that fixes this thing and lets me just live my life and feed my children and go to the movies and keep my job and be the person that I'm trying to be without having to put this fire out. I warn you, do not make that mistake. Yes, you cannot solve every problem in the world. The entire world is burning every day. Literally, if you go to the Brazil and rainforest, things are burning. You cannot do it all, but we can all do some. And doing some really counts. It really does affect change. So I'm not asking you all to stop your careers and become writers and become activists, but I am asking you, if you find yourself, like the author in the novel was, willfully looking away from something, and you catch yourself doing it, please don't. Please stop and look at that thing. Because the thing that we all need to remember is these topics, these issues, these incidences, whether they be racism, whether they be sexism, LGBTQ violence, violence against Asian Americans, all these issues, climate change, everything, they happen to people. They do not happen to statistics and numbers. And they're not just a headline that you read in a magazine or you read on your phone. When someone is shot and murdered, their family still exists. The family of Freddie Gray still lives. Cousins, nieces, nephews, uncles, aunts, friends that he knew, they still exist, and he is missing from their life. George Floyd, same thing. Aunts, uncles, friends, family, maybe children. People that he loved and that loved him, he is still missing from their life every single day. So we cannot look away from these things. We have to take them in moderation. We have to protect ourselves, but we can no longer pretend that the fire is not burning. We can no longer wait for someone else to extinguish it. At some point, we have to say, my voice is enough to help, and I will use that. Thank you. Thank you all so much. So now we transition into the Q&A answer, Q&A portion of things. And I also want to take a quick second to, so there are people here who have heard my other things, and I guarantee they were like, oh, he's gonna be so funny and comedy all night. And they just got that. I call that the old bait and switch. I get you lulled into a nice little sense of, oh, it's just so funny and comedy, then bam, hit you with the heavy stuff. So yes, so again, thank you all for coming out. Let's do some questions. What questions do you guys have about book writing, anything?
Yesterday and completed.
Uh-oh, we got the mic. I can hear you from there though. There you go. You're a pro.
So first of all, I need you to get out of my head, right? That whole thing. question is, where do you decide that you want to do this? Like, is it just in literature, or is it other places? Because when we had our game of food incidents, we were out in the community, I wanted to, be all about social action because I'm a sorority as well, and that's, one of our missions. But at the end of the day, I said, there's enough fights in the library that I can, there's a lot of things that I can do in the library, and I just want to stretch myself thin. So I guess my question is, where do you decide to fight, and when do you say, so I guess that's my question, because it can be a lot. It can be a lot.
Yes, yeah. No, that's a great question and a very fair question. I think one of the first things you have to do is, self-care. We all have to guard our own emotions more than anyone else ever can. And so for me personally, like literature and writing will always be my primary means of engaging with social issues and topics. Like that is how I fight. Because one is the thing that I have spent most of my life trying to learn how to do, is how to be a writer. It's the thing I do best. I'm a terrible boyfriend. I'm a terrible driver. I'm terrible at everything else in life, except writing. That's the one thing I do fairly well. So that's where I put my energy. And I also learned, I know myself. I can stand before an audience and I can talk and I can give a good show. But when I tell you I am a hardcore introvert, I am not joking. Like I'll sleep for 3 days after this once I'm done. Because like being in front of a crowd is exhausting. So for me, if I had to do this, if this was my form of activism, like if all I did was do these kinds of talks, I could not do it. Emotionally, I could not maintain it. So that goes into the self-care category. You have to figure out how much of yourself you can give and in what form that will take. Not everyone is meant to be out marching in the streets and doing all of that. Not everyone is meant to be writing about it. Not everyone is meant to be acting or making movies. You have to find the thing that is good for you. Being a librarian, I think, is very powerful because, again, you have so much influence over what people are reading. Librarians, I just told you guys, like, librarians picked out my literature for years. And to this day, when any librarian recommends a book, I will at least check it out because I've been conditioned to do that. So I think the tip is, as I said, you have to find the threshold where you are okay to do it emotionally and intellectually. But with that, the one asterisk I'll put beside that is do not live in your comfort zone. That's one of the most dangerous things that we can ever do in life is just exist in our comfort zone, because your comfort zone exists because nothing changes there. And that is the most horrible way to kind of the sin of inactivism, where you see something happen, but it's outside your comfort zone. So I'm not worried about that. So that's my tip. Hopefully that helps. Thank you. Next question. Yep. Okay, yes. So the two voices, as in like the author and then Soot, like those two, okay. So when I was writing the book, I mentioned it briefly, but didn't go into detail. It initially began as me writing about weird, wacky adventures on book tour. I had like half a novel at some point that was just stories of things that happened on book tour. And then the Freddie Gray incident happened. I started writing about my thoughts on race and those memories that I told you guys about and all these things. And I had a separate pile that was about 150, 200 pages of very serious, heavy stuff on race. And I wanted to mix the two books together. But I knew that the author on book tour stuff was so separate and so distinct, and I wanted to explore that. I was like, how far away from all these serious issues can I keep this author and for how long? And that eventually became the theme of the book. This author was trying so hard to hide from these other narratives. And so I knew that that was going to work there. So I had to figure out how to tell the story of all these issues that I was writing about that were not a story yet. They were just moments and thoughts. So I thought about that incident that happened when I was 10 years old. And I was like, I think that'll be the way to I'll recreate that incident, that shooting of our mayor. That'll be one of the ways that I can tell this story. And so I'll create this character who was 10 years old, at the same age I was when this thing happened, and try to tell it through his perspective and his eyes and his life. And through doing it through his story, it was essentially me working through my own story in many ways. Again, fudging the numbers here and there with fiction when I needed to, but also trying to really tell what actually happened there and have that narrative. So that's kind of how the two stories evolved. The weird, funny one though is the character of the kid that shows up in like the author's story. I have no clue where that character came from. And I promise I do not need medication. But it really was a case where I was writing a scene one day and I had this author, again, this is pretty early in the book. This author came out of his hotel room and he comes downstairs and he's eating breakfast. And I'm just sitting at my computer. I'm like, yeah, he's eating breakfast and stuff's happening. And then there's this kid and the kid asked me, and it's like, wait, who? And I had to stop and look back. And I saw this character that was just, this kid sits down beside the author. I had written that. This kid sits down across from the author. And it's like, okay, I'll just go with it. Because that's how I write. When I see something, I just run with it and see where it goes. So the author starts asking questions to the kid, and the kid starts asking, they just start having a conversation. And I'm just sitting there at the computer writing their conversation down. I had no plan for this character. I had never mapped him out. I knew nothing about him. I just started writing him, and he worked really well with the author. The two characters just got along on their own. And I kept writing him. And before long, he was an essential part of the novel that I had to really focus on and include. But it's funny, like I did not plan for that character in the least. He just showed up, just as he does in the book. He just shows up one day and suddenly there he was, and it became a very cool part of the book. So yeah, it's a fun fact. Question over there. Okay. The police officer who shot the mayor, nothing. There was no trial. There was an investigation. He was cleared and he moved to another county. And I think years later, he moved to like another state. He just relocated, as oftentimes happens after shootings. He just relocated, and that was the end of it. His family tried to kind of pursue it for a while, but once he kind of relocated, it just fizzled and faded away, and nothing came of it. Yeah, which is kind of how it goes, unfortunately. Next question. Yes, I got you.
So I feel like I'm a pro at that.
Awesome.
So then I read the book over the summer, and it was so uncomfortable. The biggest part that gave me comfort was the author's ability to actually look at these like
Mhm.
so much. And I started to realize parts of my life that are very important to me in my life that I do the same thing, and it started to actually make me that to be careful. By the end of the book, I was so thankful. So it was like one of those where I just went through a journey reading your book, and I just wanted to say thank you for writing it. It was just very, very powerful for me and pulled me out of my comfort zone the way that I was uncomfortable.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That's beautiful. Yes, thank you. That was the goal, to shake people's trees, so to speak. And I'm glad that happened. Thank you so much. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for writing this book. There were two parts that I found incredibly important and incredibly moving as everything I would read. The first is the discussion the author had with the sheriff who shot her. And you captured that white supremacy mentality so succinctly that I wish everybody of every race and creed would read that, because it was very powerful and it was right on. So I thank you for that. And the second discussion was the talk. And you did that beautifully. I didn't know what the talk was before, but the pain that parents go through in having to come to that point with the adolescent and having to sit down and essentially take away their innocence was very moving. And I'm also glad that I didn't read yours first. I've been reading for over 2 years, and it's just so upset with the George Floyd murder that I didn't know what to do. So the only thing I thought to do was start reading. And I've been reading for 2 years and I still have a long list. And because I've done all that reading, I think I got a lot more out of the book. And I will if I had just come across it at the beginning. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for reading. That's beautiful. Thank you very much. Next, back there in the back.
On your tour of this book, were they embarrassed?
No, so it's really interesting, and obviously very meta to be on tour that's about an author touring for a book that's about a book on tour. There's so many layers to it. It's been very funny. Like the funniest thing is interviewers oftentimes, like I had so many interviewers who I'll meet them and they're about to interview me and they'll go, I don't know what to ask you because you spent your entire book saying how you hate when people ask you what your book is about. So I don't know how to talk to you now. And I think it's absolutely hilarious. There's that component. I meet people who, after reading the book, they think I'm an alcoholic. And I actually don't drink at all, really. But people think I'm an alcoholic. Like, they will ask me, like, hey, do you want to go get drinks or do you want to not get drinks? Like, that's the other side of it. It's funny. I was in Italy like a month ago, like doing book stuff, and my publisher was there. And in Italy, everyone drinks wine they drink wine with wine. Like they just drink all the time. And it's because it's very cultural. And so I got there and like we're having dinner the first night and they're pouring drinks and like my glass was there and they're reflexively, they're like, oh, do you want some? And then someone at the table was like, no, he doesn't drink. Just didn't you read the book? And so I had to say, like, no, I really don't drink, but not for that reason. But it's funny because then when they found out that like I'm not a recovering alcoholic or anything like that, I've never had a taste for alcohol. That's really all it is. But once they found that out, then they were like trying to make me drink. Because it is such a cultural thing to where like it got to the point where whenever we went out, I had to have at least like a sliver because it's almost like they don't trust you if you don't have a sip of the wine at dinner with them. So there's that component. I meet women who oftentimes like they have a lot of questions about like how much of the book was true. Like, are you womanizing women in the hotels? And if so, can I show up one night? And weird conversations which my girlfriend is not happy about. And the other thing is, so there's a section in the book about like dating these Kellys. A lot of those dating stories were actual real events that have happened to me. And one of the rules of writing is that if you write about your exes, they will read it and they will not be happy. So I've had some awkward phone calls in the last year and a half about certain things that showed up in the book, but luckily they're all okay with it. So it worked out well. Next question. All the way in the back. Hi. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. This is a fun question. Okay, so there's multiple parts to the answer to this question. The first and most important part of it is I am a massive Nick Cage fan. I have been for decades. And I don't mean it in that like some people are like ironic Nick Cage fans where they don't like him, but they think it's fun to pretend they like him. Like, no, like I love the man. I think he's a genius. My first Nick Cage movie was Raising Arizona. It's the first thing I remember him being in, and it is absolutely amazing. And this is so I tell the whole story of how so there's a scene in the book where the author is on a flight and he meets Nick Cage. I wish that was a true scene, but it's not. And so that is one of the most for a lot of people, that's the most memorable scene in the book in many ways, like in the positive side. Like they just, oh my God, how'd you get Nick Cage in your book? And they love that scene. And I was telling people earlier at dinner, that scene happened at the last possible moment. Like literally about a week before the book was going to be shopped around to agents and editors, that scene was not in the book at all. So the backstory here is there were plenty of Nick Cage jokes and references throughout the book. Like they were there. My agent, I've been with her for 10 years. She knows I'm a Nick Cage junkie. So it was all fine. And her and I were doing some revisions to the novel. And there was a scene, there was like one of the sex scenes, that had a bunch of sex scenes in it. There was one sex scene, and my agent said, this scene needs to go. She said, it's funny, it's got some great jokes, but it's not moving the plot forward. It's not stirring anything up. It's just spinning its wheels. And we don't want to do that. We need to keep things moving. And so she said, either put a new scene in, either rewrite it entirely, put something new in, or cut it completely and just, cover it up so no one knows it was even there to begin with. So I got really upset. Like I got kind of pissed off because I had put a lot of work into this sex scene that was very funny and hilarious. And to have to cut it out, especially this late in the game, I was kind of upset about. And so I was talking to her and I was kind of frustrated and kind of being a bit of a smart ass. I said, well, if I cut that scene, I'm putting Nick Cage in the book. And she said, I dare you. And I didn't know what to say to that. So I said, well, I will. I will. And I was really nervous because I was like, can you put Nick Cage in a book? Like legally, can you do that? Like, will he show up and sue me to death one day for putting him in a book? And so I read on this dare for my agent. I sat down and I started writing the scene of Nick Cage meeting this author on a plane because I figured that's the most likely place to meet Nick Cage. I mean, where else would you meet him? And then a funny thing happened. Very suddenly, I began to realize why I actually liked Nick Cage. Yes, talent is part of it, his selection of movies, like there is that part of it as well. But the thing that I really admire about Nick Cage is he is much smarter than people give him credit for. He understands the image that he projects and the lore and the mystique surrounding him. He knows that there's like Nick Cage memes of him everywhere, and that he's got this reputation for being this wild man who shows up and does inexplicable stuff. He has a legend that he has around him, whether he wants to or not, it's there. He knows about it, and he controls that narrative very clearly and very succinctly. You don't really know much about his real life, how many kids he has, how many times, he's been married a lot, there's a whole thing there. But when it comes to personal facts about him, we know very few, and because he controls that narrative. So what Nick Cage does is he controls the way, he understands how people see him, and he controls that narrative. And that is an amazingly powerful thing to do. It requires a lot of intelligence, a lot of cleverness, a lot of insightfulness. And in a book that is all about not being seen for who you are, and for not being able to control the narrative that is told about you, what better figure, what better metaphor than to have this character show up who is the master of controlling all the things that people think about him? What else would you desire to be? If you're a person who feels that they cannot control the national narrative about people that look like them, who else would you admire but someone who controls it so flawlessly and easily? That's when I realized that's actually why I like Nick Cage, because he has the ability to do the thing that I and many other Black people wish that they could do, which is control how people see you and really guide that narrative. So that is how the Nick Cage moment appears and suddenly galvanized the entire book. It just congealed things I didn't even know were there and made it work. Because Nick Cage does that. I think he just and magic came down on my computer that day. And he knew I was writing it. He just sent a signal to the universe and it worked out. So yeah, that's kind of how that happens. Next question. One more question. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry. You got to scream something.
Good. I want to go back to the idea of comfort zone and being So I'm a professor and work with a lot of students in that sort of 18 to about 28.
Sure.
And of course, I love saying things like, "Oh, you really need to be out of your comfort zone."
Mhm.
to be able to see the keep pushing yourself.
Mhm.
But more and more I realize that it's a privilege to say that, but to be out of your comfort zone, implies that you have, it implies you have a safe space.
Mhm.
And more, particularly with like the all of COVID, there's a lot of things that we're going through, there's season in life. And particularly when you're talking about young people of color, people are just looking for safe spaces.
Yes.
So they're going into jobs like teaching and nursing because they're always like,
Yes.
I just want to be safe.
Mhm.
So I guess what I'm asking is, so what do you say to encourage, what would you say to encourage those students that like this, when you do need to keep pushing, even once you find a safe space, you need to keep pushing yourself out of your safe space, continue to do so,
Mhm.
because you're the next generation.
Yes.
We're kind of counting on you. I think of that scene where the whole Black Lives Matter was like walked by the auditor and you're like, you know, flip this on me too.
Mhm.
And I feel bad because I'm putting it on them.
Yeah.
But I need them to do this, but I also know why.
Yeah.
They just want to.
Yeah.
What's your?
Yeah, so my advice to that is, for like everyone, you have to be realistic about the expectations that we put on the youth or whoever else it is. The majority of people, just people, doesn't matter if they're youth, they're minority, whatever, like the majority of people seek out and exist in comfort zones their entire lives. That is just a fact. And so, yes, we want to get the youth in particular to kind of break out of those comfort zones and definitely encourage them, but just understand that for most of them, they won't, and that's okay. That is absolutely okay. You will always have a small group who do, a small group who refuse to exist in that comfort zone and who break out of that and who, you know, cut new territory and create new ground and break down new barriers. I think the key is to not necessarily kind of chide or deride those who stay in that comfort zone, because people who stay in comfort zones oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes do it because they need that safety. They need that place. So yeah, don't necessarily demonize them, but when you see someone and you recognize they're on the cusp of breaking out of that comfort zone, help them. Like race to help them break out. Try to say anything you can. Like there is no set speech that I can give to help people, but I will just try to encourage people. The other thing that I tell people oftentimes is that 90% of your choices will be okay eventually. And I put it eventually on there because you can definitely make choices that screw up your life for a brief period of time. But especially when you talk to like teenagers and high schoolers, like, I mean, I'm sure you all remember, like, it seems as though when you're in high school, you think of high school as like the entire universe. And you're so stressed about, am I wearing the right clothes? And am I with the cool kids? And if I don't, my entire life is ruined. Like, look back on your life now. Like, do you even remember high school? Like, name one choice in high school that really ruined your life. There are very few. And so I tell people, like, mistakes, we are usually conditioned to try to live perfect lives. Don't make any mistakes. Don't do anything wrong. Make everything think about decisions for years before you make them. And I agree with that to a point. But I've got nieces and nephews, and I tell them all the time, go fuck up. Don't fuck up big, but just go fuck up a little bit. Make a plan for 90% of the thing you're going to do and leave 10% open to fate. Flip a coin at some point in your journey. I tell my niece that. I got a niece, she went to Seattle to do a K-pop concert for her birthday. And when she was in Seattle, she was texting me about, she had met these friends, they were doing stuff and blah, blah, blah. And I texted her, I said, make a decision, but flip a coin at some point. I said, at some point in your weekend, if you have to choose between two things, just flip a coin and see what happens. Do that at least once while you're there. And she did, and she wound up going somewhere and had a great time. So that's one thing I tell people, yes, make good decisions. And I always encourage young people, think about your decisions, they will impact you. But I also put that little asterisk on there, like, they may impact you for a while. And you don't want to make decisions that will negatively, like, really dig a deep hole. But man, like, make mistakes. Because mistakes are where you find beauty and wonder and new things and meet cool new people. Mistakes are how you get outside of your comfort zone. Because usually if you're outside the comfort zone, you didn't plan on being there. You fucked up somewhere. You made a mistake somewhere. You turned down the wrong street. You dated the wrong person. You did something. Oh, mistakes. Mistakes get you out of your comfort zone whether you want to or not. So yeah, I tell people, make good decisions, but flip a coin every once in a while. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Well, thank you all of you for coming. Jason's going to be out front signing books, so let's show him our appreciation and let us sign books. Thank you, everyone.